This week, the government signed off on a new tariff that almost every headline described as a story about solar panels and trade with China. It is not really a story about solar panels. It is a story about a metal that has been running in a supply deficit for 6 straight years. And the policy signed this week may have just made that deficit worse in a way that even the people who wrote it may not have fully worked out yet. I need to walk you through this carefully because it is one of the more genuinely strange contradictions I've seen sitting inside a piece of trade policy. And if you hold silver or are thinking about holding it, this affects you directly, not in theory, but through a mechanism that started moving this week. Here's the twist, and I am giving it to you right away instead of making you wait. The new tariff targets polysilicon, the raw refined material that sits at the very base of every solar panel made anywhere in the world. On its surface, that sounds like a China story, a manufacturing story, an energy policy story. But polysilicon production and processing sits directly upstream of one of silver's single largest industrial customers because silver paste is what actually carries electricity across the surface of a solar cell. You cannot build a modern solar panel without it. So a tariff aimed at slowing down cheap imported solar components does not stay contained inside the solar industry. It reaches directly into the demand side of a silver market that was already 6 years into a structural shortage before this tariff existed. And here is the part almost nobody has said plainly. The government currently has 2 goals for solar policy that pull in opposite directions at the exact same time. It wants to make imported polysilicon more expensive to slow down Chinese solar dominance. It also wants domestic solar manufacturing to grow, which requires the same material to become more affordable for manufacturers building here at home. Those 2 goals cannot both be true using the same tariff. Something in that contradiction has to give, and silver sits directly in the crossfire of figuring out what does. Before I go further, I want to know who is with me right now. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and tell me honestly whether you knew before this video that a tariff on solar materials could actually reach into the silver market at all. I read these, and I promise you the pattern in the comments under a video like this always reveals how rare it is for someone to have already connected a trade policy story to a metal story before clicking play. Let me lay out exactly what happened and why the timing makes it even more significant. This week's polysilicon tariff landed in the middle of an already tense trade relationship, arriving days after China had already responded to earlier trade actions with its own countermeasures. The pattern of escalation matters here more than any single tariff in isolation, because trade disputes rarely stay confined to the exact product named in the original announcement. China is not simply the world's dominant producer of solar equipment. It is also a major consumer of silver in its own right through electronics and electric vehicle components, which means this is not a story about America restricting an import. It is a story about 2 of the largest economies on Earth nudging each other deeper into a standoff that touches a metal both of them need. And the shortage this tariff is landing on top of is not a mild or debatable one. According to the most recent World Silver Survey, the market has now recorded its 6th consecutive year of supply deficit, a shortfall of 46.3 million ounces in the most recent year alone. Since 2021, the market has drawn down roughly 762 million ounces from above-ground stockpiles, just to keep up with demand that mining alone cannot satisfy. That is not a small cushion being nibbled at. That is a genuinely enormous buffer, built up over decades, being steadily emptied year after year, and industrial demand, driven heavily by exactly the solar sector this tariff now touches, makes up close to 58% of everything silver is used for annually. If you are finding this useful already, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because the next part explains why this contradiction cannot simply be fixed by tweaking a percentage on a tariff sheet. And it is the part that separates this story from an ordinary trade dispute. Here is the mechanism as plainly as I can walk you through it. Raising the cost of imported polysilicon is meant to protect and grow domestic solar manufacturing by making foreign competition more expensive. But American solar manufacturers still need polysilicon themselves, whether it is imported or eventually produced domestically at scale. And domestic polysilicon production capacity does not appear overnight simply because a tariff makes imports less attractive. Building that capacity takes years, real investment, and specialized infrastructure that does not exist at the necessary scale yet. In the meantime, a tariff that raises costs for importers also risks raising costs for the very domestic manufacturers. The policy is supposedly trying to help, because most of them still depend on some imported material while domestic capacity slowly catches up. If it catches up at all, that is the contradiction I mentioned at the start, and it cannot be resolved with the tariff alone. It requires an entire industrial policy build-out that does not yet fully exist, and until it does, uncertainty sits directly on top of the solar sector's ability to plan its own silver demand with any real confidence. This is precisely why silver has actually lagged behind gold's own rally this week, rather than moving in perfect lockstep with it. Gold climbed on a completely separate set of forces. Weak jobs data pulling down expectations for a Fed rate hike in September. Silver, which normally tracks gold closely, moved less, because sitting on top of the same rate story is this entirely separate layer of uncertainty about what a tariff-driven contradiction in solar policy does to the demand side of an already tight physical market. Two different metals, two different stories layered on top of each other. And most people watching the price only see one number moving without understanding why it is moving less than its usual partner. Let me make this real with two people, because none of this matters until you see how it lands in an actual life. Neither is real, but both are the kind of person you might recognize. The first I will call Desmond, 69, who has held a modest position in silver for a couple of years, mostly because he liked the story about industrial demand from solar and electric vehicles. When headlines this week mentioned a new solar tariff, he assumed it was simply bad news, a tax that would slow down the exact industry he was counting on to drive silver demand higher, and he considered trimming his position out of caution. What Desmond did not stop to work through is that the tariff does not eliminate the underlying need for silver in solar production at all. It simply adds cost and uncertainty to how that silver gets used, and by whom, layered on top of a physical shortage that has nothing to do with this week's headline and everything to do with 6 years of consumption outpacing mining. The second person I will call Rosalind, 67, and she took a slower, more deliberate look at the same headline. Rather than reacting to the word tariff as automatically bad for an industrial metal, she asked what the tariff actually changes about the underlying deficit. And the honest answer is very little in the near term. Solar manufacturers still need silver paste, regardless of where their polysilicon comes from or what it costs them. The 6-year deficit does not close because of a new trade policy layered on top of it. If anything, a policy this contradictory, pulling domestic and import goals in opposite directions at once, tends to create the kind of prolonged uncertainty that keeps physical buyers cautious about expanding supply commitments, which does nothing to help a market already this tight. Desmond reacted to a headline. Rosalind traced the actual mechanism underneath it and arrived at a very different read on the same news. The difference between them was never how much silver either one owned. It was that one of them treated the word tariff as a simple verdict, good or bad. And one of them understood that a tariff sitting on top of an industrial supply chain, this complicated rarely resolves into a simple verdict at all. Now, why do so many careful, intelligent people end up like Desmond, reacting to a single word in a headline rather than tracing what it actually does to the underlying market? Part of it is that trade policy headlines are written for speed. A single word, tariff, raise, cut, meant to convey a clear direction in an instant. The human mind naturally treats a word like that as the whole story, because it is presented as the whole story, even when the actual mechanism underneath it runs through years of supply chain build-out, competing government goals, and a physical shortage that predates the headline by half a decade. The investors who consistently read these moments correctly are rarely the ones reacting fastest to the headline. They are the ones willing to trace the actual chain before deciding what a single word in a policy announcement really changes. There is a historical echo worth knowing here, because trade policy colliding with a commodity already in short supply has played out before with consequences that took people by surprise. Go back to the various metals tariffs and export restrictions of past decades, where a policy aimed at protecting one domestic industry ended up squeezing supply for a related industry that depended on the same raw material, producing price effects far beyond what the original policy intended or anticipated. The lesson from those episodes is not that today is an exact repeat, because it never is. The lesson is that when policymakers design a tariff around one stated goal, protecting domestic manufacturing, they do not always fully account for what that tariff does to the underlying commodity markets, sitting several layers removed from the headline. And those secondary effects can end up mattering more than the original policy goal itself. There is a second, quieter dimension to this worth understanding, and it involves who actually absorbs a tariff. Like this one inches the near term. Solar developers building large-scale projects typically lock in equipment costs months or sometimes years in advance through supply contracts. A sudden new tariff does not simply vanish into the ether. It either gets absorbed by manufacturers already operating on thin margins, passed along to developers who then pass it to utilities, or it gets contested and delayed through legal and regulatory challenges that can drag on for months. Each of those paths creates a different kind of uncertainty for how much actual physical silver demand from the solar sector shows up on schedule this year versus getting pushed into next year. And that timing uncertainty is exactly the kind of thing that keeps a physically tight market like silver harder to read in the short term, even while the 6-year structural deficit underneath it keeps grinding along, regardless of how this particular contradiction eventually gets resolved. Now, let me be careful and honest with you, because I will not insult you with fear. And this exact subject draws people who want to frighten you into a rushed decision. This tariff does not guarantee silver prices spike, and it does not guarantee the shortage worsens dramatically from here. It is entirely possible domestic polysilicon capacity builds out faster than expected, easing the contradiction I described. It is possible ongoing negotiations soften the tariff's actual impact before it fully takes hold. And it is worth remembering that silver remains a genuinely volatile metal, capable of moving sharply in either direction on any given week, regardless of the deeper structural story underneath it. Anyone telling you this tariff guarantees a specific price target is guessing and dressing. That guess up as analysis and deserves your skepticism. What I am giving you is not a prediction of where silver goes next. It is an understanding of a mechanism that most coverage of this tariff completely missed, so that you can read the next headline about it with a clearer sense of what is actually at stake underneath the surface. I want to say a word about gold here too, because the two metals are diverging in an interesting way right now. Gold does not carry this same industrial exposure, so this particular tariff barely touches it directly. Gold's rally this week has been driven almost entirely by the separate story of softening jobs data and shifting expectations for the Federal Reserve's next move. Silver carries both of those same rate-driven forces, and this additional industrial supply chain story layered on top, which is exactly why the two metals, normally closely correlated, are behaving a little differently from each other this week. And understanding that divergence tells you something real about which forces are dominant in each market right now. So let us pull this together and go back to where we started. A tariff that headlines described simply as a solar and China story actually reaches directly into a silver market that has posted 6 consecutive years of supply deficit, a shortfall of 46.3 million ounces in the latest year alone, with 762 million ounces already drawn from stockpiles since 2021. The policy behind it contains a genuine contradiction, trying to make the same material simultaneously more expensive for importers and more affordable for domestic manufacturers. A contradiction that cannot be resolved without a real industrial build-out that does not yet exist at scale. That uncertainty is a real part of why silver has lagged gold's own rally this week, even as both metals benefit from a softer outlook on Fed policy. And the difference between the people who understood what this tariff actually touches and the people who only saw the word tariff and reacted on instinct comes down to one thing: whether you trace the mechanism or reacted to the headline. Here is what I want you to carry away from this, stated as plainly as I know how. This is not a call to make a sudden move based on 1 week's tariff news, because balance and patience matter, especially for anyone near or already in retirement. It is a call to understand that trade policy and precious metals are far more tangled together than most coverage lets on, and that a headline using the word tariff tells you almost nothing on its own about whether the underlying market gets tighter or looser as a result. Whether a modest, deliberate allocation to silver belongs in your own plan depends entirely on your own circumstances, your own timeline, and your own comfort with volatility. And I am not here to tell you the number. I am here to make sure that the next trade headline you read gets traced all the way through instead of reacted to at the surface. Do not let anyone use this story to rush you into a costly decision, because there will be people trying, and they get louder every time a headline like this breaks. And do not dismiss it either. Telling yourself a solar tariff on the other side of a trade negotiation could not possibly matter to the metal sitting in your own portfolio, because you just watched exactly how directly it does. Those are two different mistakes, and the sensible path sits calmly between them. None of this is financial advice. Every figure I have referenced, the sixth consecutive annual silver deficit, the 46.3 million ounce shortfall, the 762 million ounces drawn from stockpiles since 2021, the industrial share of silver demand, comes directly from the World Silver Survey and current market reporting on this week's tariff. So you can verify every word of it yourself rather than take mine. I opened by telling you that a tariff sold as a solar panel story is actually a silver shortage story, and that the contradiction hiding inside it may be one the government cannot easily solve. Now you understand exactly why a policy pulling two opposite directions at once, landing directly on top of a metal that has been running short for 6 straight years. So let me leave you with the question underneath all of it. When a trade policy contains a contradiction its own writers may not have fully resolved, and that contradiction sits directly on top of a shortage that has been building for half a decade, how much longer can that tension stay quiet before the market decides to price it in all at once?